Nicholas Spark, Message in a Bottle. Do you believe in love? Nicholas Sparks and J.K. Rowling are the only contemporary authors to have a novel spend more than a year on both the New York Times hardcover and a paperback bestseller list. The Notebook, Nights in Roddental, The Rescue, A Bend in a Road, True Believer, At First Sight, and Dear John have all reached the number one spot. All Nicholas Sparks novels have been international bestsellers and have been translated into more than 30 languages. Message in a Bottle, A Walk to Remember, and A Notebook have been adapted into major films. Nicholas Sparks lives in North Carolina with his wife and family. Praise for Nicholas Sparks will have you be weeping for the joy and tragedy of it all. Daily Mail. A page turner, Sparks fan won't be disappointed. Glamour. Deeply moving and beautifully written. Book list. Very moving. Closer. Sparks writing in superb. Women. Spark writes with a depth of feeling and a tenderness rarely seen in a male authors, and at times he brought tears of both joy and sadness to my eyes. Peterborough Evening Telegraph. Worth spending a night with. People. Moving Daily Express. Sparks addresses the difficulties and struggles of people adjusting to sharing their intimate lives. Irish News. Written with a real affection and honesty. Southern Daily Age. Every now and then you stumble across the extraordinary book that at first appears like countless others, but then you read it and are amazed at the treasure hidden within. New York Sunday Spot. Prologue. The bottle was dropped overboard on a warm summer evening, a few hours before the rain began to fall. Like all bottles, it was fragile and would break if dropped a few feet from the ground. But when sealed properly and sent to sea, as this one was, it became one of the most seaworthy objects known to man. It could float safely through hurricanes or tropical storms. It could bob at the most dangerous of riptides. It was, in a way, the ideal home for the message it carried inside. A message that had been sent to fulfill a promise. Like that of all bottles left to the whim of the oceans. Its course was unpredictable. Winds and currents play large roles in any bottle's direction. Storms and debris may shift its course as well. Occasionally, a fishing net will snag a bottle and carry it a dozen miles in the opposite direction in which it was headed. The result is that two bottles dropped simultaneously into the ocean might end up a continent apart, or even on opposite sides of the globe. There is no way to predict where a bottle might travel, and that is a part of its mystery. This mystery has integrated people for as long as there have been bottles, and few people have tried to learn more about it. A crew of German scientists set out to track the journey of a particular bottle. It was set to sea in the South Indian Ocean with a note inside asking the finder to record the location where it washed up and throw it back into the sea. So it had rounded the world and traveled approximately 16,000 miles, the longest distance officially recorded. Messages in bottle have been chronicled for centuries and include some of the most famous names in history. Ben Franklin, for instance, used message carrying bottles to compile a basic knowledge of East Coast currents in the mid and information that is still in use to this day. Even though the US Navy uses bottles to compile information on tides and currents, and they are frequently used to track the direction of oil spills. The most celebrated messages ever sent concerned a young sailor, Chansky Matsuyama, who was stranded on a coral reef devoid of food and water after his boat was shipwrecked. Before his death, he carved the account of what has happened on a piece of wood, then sealed the message in a bottle. 150 years after, it had been a sea flood. It washed up in a small seaside village in Japan where Matsushima had been burned. The bottle that had been dropped on a warm summer evening, however, did not contain a message about a shipwreck, nor was it being used to chart the seas, but it did contain a message that would change two people forever. Two people who would otherwise never have met. And for this reason, it could be called a fated message. For 6 days, it slowly floated in a northeasterly direction, driven by winds from a higher pressure system hovering above the Gulf of Mexico. On the seventh day, the winds died and the bottle steered itself directly eastward, eventually finding its way to the Gulf Stream, where it then picked up speed and traveling north at almost 70 miles per day. 2.5 weeks after its launch, the bottle still followed the Gulf Stream. On the seventh day, however, another storm, this time over the mid-Atlantic, brought easterly winds strong enough to drive the bottle from the current. And the bottle began to drift towards New England without the Gulf Stream forcing it along. The bottle slowed again and it zigzagged in various directions near the Massachusetts shore for the 5 days until it was snagged in a fishing net by John Hannes. Hannes found the bottle surrounded by 1,000 flopping perch and tossed it aside while he examined his catch. As luck would have it, the bottle didn't break. But it was promptly forgotten and remained near the bow of the boat for the rest of the afternoon and early evening as the boat made its journey back to Cape Cod Bay. At 8:30 that night, and once the boat was safely inside the confines of the bay, Hans stumbled across the bottle again while smoking a cigarette. Because the sun was dropping lower in the sky, he picked it up but saw nothing unusual inside, and he tossed it overboard without a second glance, thereby ensuring that the bottle would wash up along one of the many small communities that lined the bay. It didn't happen right away, however. The bottle drifted back and forth for a few days, as if deciding where to go before choosing its course. And it finally washed up along the shore on a beach near Chatham. And it was there, after 26 days and 783 miles, that it ended its journey. Chapter 1. A cold December wind was blowing, and Teresa Byrne crossed her arms as she stared out over the water. Earlier, when she'd arrived, there had been a few people walking along the shore, but they would taken note of the clothes and were long since gone. Now she found herself alone on the beach, and she took in her surroundings. The ocean, reflecting the color of the sky, and looked like liquid iron, and waves rolled up steadily on the shore. Heavy clouds were descending slowly, and the fog was beginning to thicken, making the horizon invisible. In another place, in another time, she would have felt the majesty of the beauty around her. But as she stood on the beach, she realized that she didn't feel anything at all. In a way, she felt as if she weren't really here, as if the whole thing was nothing but a dream. She would drive in here this morning, thought she scarcely remembered the trip at all. When she would make the decision to come, she planned to stay overnight. She would make the arrangements and had even looked forward to a quiet night away from Boston. But watching the ocean swirl and churn made her realize that she didn't want to stay. She would drive home as soon as she was finished, no matter how late it was. When she was finally ready, Teresa slowly started to walk towards the water. Beneath her arm, she carried a bag that she had carefully packed that morning, making sure that she hadn't forgotten anything. She hadn't told anyone what she carried with her, nor had she told them what she would intended to do today. Instead, she would say that she was going Christmas shopping. It was the perfect excuse, and thought she was sure that they would have understood had she told them the truth. This trip was something she didn't want to share with anyone. It had started with her alone, and that was the same way she wanted it to end. Teresa sighed and checked her watch. Soon it would be high tide. And it was then that she would finally be ready after finding a spot on a small dune that looked comfortable. She sat in the sand and opened her bag. Searching through it, she found the envelope she wanted, and taking a deep breath, she slowly lifted the seal. In it were 3 letters, carefully folded, and letters that she would read more times than she could count. Holding them in front of her, she sat on the sand and stared at them. In the bag were other items as well, though she wasn't ready to look at those yet. Instead, she continued to focus on the letters. He would use a fountain pen when he would write on them, and there were smudges in various places where the pen had leaked. The stationery, with its picture of a sailing ship in the upper right-hand corner, was beginning to discolor in places, fading slowly with the passage of time. She knew there would come a day when the words would be impossible to read. But hopefully, after today, she wouldn't feel the need to look at them so often. When she finished, she slipped them back into the envelope as carefully as she would remove them. Then, after putting the envelope back into the bag, she looked at the beach again from where she was sitting, and she could see the places where it had all started. She would be jogging at daybreak, she remembered, and she could picture that summer morning clearly. It was the beginning of the beautiful day. As she took in the world around her, she listened to the high-pitched squawing of terns and the gentle lapping of the waves as they rolled up on the sand. Even though she was on a vacation, she had risen early enough to run so that she didn't have to watch where she was going. In a few hours, the beach would be packed with tourists lying on their towels in the hot New England sun, soaking up the rays, and Cape Cod was always crowded at that time of the year. But most vacationers tended to sleep a little later, and she enjoyed the sensation of jogging on the hard, smooth sand left from the outgoing tide, unlike the sidewalk back home. The sand seemed to give just enough, and she knew her knees wouldn't age as they sometimes did after running on cemented pathways. She had always liked to jog, a habit she had picked up from running cross country and track in high school. Though she wasn't competitive anymore and seldom timed her runs, running was now one of the few times she could be alone with her thoughts. She considered it to be a kind of meditation, which was why she liked to do it alone, and she never could understand why people like to run in groups. As much as she loved her son, she was glad Kevin wasn't with her. Every mother needs a break sometimes, and she was looking forward to taking it easy while she was here. No evening soccer games or swim meets, no MTV blaring in the background, no homework to help with, no waking up in the middle of the night to comfort him when he got leg cramps. She had taken him to the airport 3 days ago to catch a plane to visit his father, her ex, in California. And it was only after reminding him that Kevin realized he hadn't hugged or kissed her goodbye yet. "Sorry, Mom," he said as he wrapped his arms around her and kissed her. "Love you. Don't miss me too much, okay?" Then turning around, he handed the ticket to the flight attendant and almost skipped onto the plane without looking back. She didn't blame him for almost forgetting. At 12, he was in that awkward phase when he thought that hugging and kissing his mom in public wasn't cool. Besides, his mind was on other things. He had been looking forward to these trips since last Christmas. He and his father were going to the Grand Canyon, then would spend a week rafting down the Colorado River, and finally go on to Disneyland. It was every kid's fantasy trip, and she was happy for him. Although he would be gone for 6 weeks, she knew it was good for Kevin to spend time with his father. She and David had been on relatively good terms since they divorced 3 years ago. Although he wasn't the greatest husband, he was a good father to Kevin. He never missed sending a birthday or Christmas gift, called weekly, and traveled across the country a few times a year just to spend weekends with his son. Then, of course, there were a court mandated visit as well. 6 weeks in the summer, every other Christmas, and Easter break when school let out for a week. Anate, David's new wife, had her hands full with the baby. But Kevin liked her a lot, and he had never returned home feeling angry or neglected. In fact, he usually raved about his visits and how much fun he had. There were times when she felt a twinge of jealousy at that, but she did her best to hide it from Kevin. No, on the beach she ran at a moderate clip. Diana would be waiting for her to finish her run before she started breakfast. Brian would already be gone, and she knew, and Dursa looked forward to visiting with her. They were an older couple. Both of them were nearing 60 now, but Diana was the best friend she had. The managing editor at the newspaper where Teresa worked, Diana had been coming to the Cape with her husband Brian for years. They always stayed in the same place, the Fisher house. And when she found out that Kevin was leaving to visit his father in California for a good portion of the summer, she insisted that Teresa come along. Brian golfs every day he's here, and I liked the company, she would say, and besides, what else are you going to do? You have got to get out of the apartment sometimes. Teresa knew she was right, and after a few days of thinking it over, she finally agreed. I'm so glad. Diana had said with a victorious look on her face, you are going to love it there. Teresa had to admit it was a nice place to stay. The Fisher house was a beautifully resorted cabin house that sat on the edge of a rocky cliff overlooking Cape Cod Bay. And when she saw it in the distance, she slowed to a jog. Unlike the younger runners who sped up towards the end of their rounds, she preferred to slow down and take it easy. At 36, she didn't recover as fast as she once had. As her breathing eased, she thought about how she would spend the rest of her day. She had brought 5 books with her for the vacation, books she had been wanting to read for the last year but had never gotten around to. There just didn't seem to be enough times anymore, not with Kevin and his never-ending energy. Keeping up with the house work, and definitely not with all the work constantly piled on her desk. As a syndicated columnist for the Boston Times, she was under constant deadlines pressure to put out 3 columns a week. Most of her co-workers thought she had it made. Just type up 300 words and be done for the day. But it wasn't like that at all. To constantly come up with something original regarding parenting wasn't easy anymore, especially if she wanted to syndicate further. Already her column, Modern Parenting, went out in a 60 newspaper across the country, though most ran only 1 or 2 of her columns in a given week. And because the syndication offers had started only 18 months ago and she was a newcomer to most papers, she couldn't afford even a few off days. Column space in a most newspaper was extremely limited, and hundreds of columinists were vying for those few spots. Teresa slowed to a walk and finally stopped as a Caspian tern circled overhead. The humidity was up and she used her forearm to wipe up the perspiration from her face. She took a deep breath, held it for a moment, then exhaled before looking out over the water. Because it was early, the ocean was still murky gray. But that would change once the sun rose a little higher. It looked enticing. After a moment, she took off her shoes and socks, then walked to the water's edge to let the tiny waves lap over her feet. The water was refreshing, and she spent a few minutes wading back and forth. She was suddenly glad she had taken the time to write extra columns over the last few months so that she would be able to forget work this week. She couldn't remember the last time she didn't have a computer nearby or a meeting to attend or a deadline to meet, and it felt liberating to be away from her desk for a while. It almost felt as if she were in control of her own destiny again, as if she were just starting out in the world. True, there were dozens of things she knew she should be doing at home. The bathroom should have been wallpapered and updated by now. The nail holes in her walls needed to be sparkled, and the rest of the apartment could use some touch-up painting as well. A couple of months ago, she had both the wallpaper and some paint, towel, roots, and door handles, and a new vanity mirror, as well as all the tools she needs to take care of it. But she hadn't even opened the boxes yet. It was always something to do next weekend. Though the weekends were often just as busy as her work days, the items she bought still sat in the bags she would brought them home in, behind the vacuum, and every time she opened the closet door, they seemed to mock her good intentions. Maybe she thought to herself when she returned home. She turned her head and saw a man standing a little way down the beach, and he was older than she, maybe 50 or so, and his face was deeply tanned, as if he lived here year-round. He didn't appear to be moving, he simply stood in the water and let it wash over his legs. And she noticed that his eyes were closed, as if he were enjoying the beauty of the world without having to watch it. He was wearing faded jeans rolled up to his knees and comfortable shirt he hadn't bothered to tuck in. As she watched him, she suddenly wished she were a different kind of person. What would it be like to walk the beaches without another care in the world? How would it be to come to a quiet spot every day, away from the hustle and bustle of Boston, just to appreciate what life had to offer? She stepped out of the little farther into the water and mimicked the man, hoping to feel whatever it was that he was feeling. But when she closed her eyes, the only thing she could think about was Kevin. Lord knows she wanted to spend more time with him, and she definitely wanted to be more patient with him when they were together. She wanted to be able to sit and talk with Kevin or play Monopoly with him, or simply watch TV with him without feeling the urge to get up from the couch to do something more important. There were times when she felt like a fraud when insisting to Kevin that he came first and that family was the most important thing he would have. But the problem was that there was always something to do. Dishes to be washed, bathroom to be cleaned, the car box to be emptied. Cars needed tunes up, laundry needed to be done, and bills had to be paid, even though Kevin helped a lot with his chores. He was almost as busy as she was with school and friends and all his other activities. As it was, magazines went straight to the garbage unread, letters went unwritten, and sometimes in moments like this, she worried that her life was slipping past her. But how to change all that? Take love one day at a time. Her mother always said, but her mother didn't have to work outside the home or raise a strong and confident yet caring son without benefit of a father. She didn't understand the pressure that Teresa faced on a daily basis, neither did her younger sister, Janet, who had followed in the footsteps of their mother. She and her husband had been happily married for almost 11 years, with three wonderful girls to show for it. Edward wasn't a brilliant man, but he was honest, worked hard, and provided for his family well enough that Janet didn't have to work. There were times when Teresa thought she might like a life like that, even if it meant giving up her career. But that wasn't possible, not since David and she divorced. 3 years now, 4 if you counted the year they were separated. She didn't hate David for what he had done, but her respect for him had been shattered. Adultery, whether a one-night stand or a long affair, wasn't something she could live with. Nor did it make her feel better that he never married the woman he would be carrying on with for 2 years. The breach of trust was irreparable. David moved back to his home state of California a year after they separated and met Annette a few months later. His new wife was very religious, and little by little she got David interested in the church. David, a lifelong agnostic, had always seemed to be hungry for something more meaningful in his life. Now he attended church regularly and actually served as a marriage counselor along with the pastor. What could he possibly say to someone doing the same things he would done, she often wondered, and how could he help others if he hadn't been able to control himself? She didn't know and didn't care. Simply glad that he still took an interest in his son. Naturally, once she and David had split up, a lot of her friendships ended as well. Now that she was no longer part of a couple, she seemed to be out of the place at friends' Christmas parties or backyard barbecue. A few friends remained, though, and she heard from them on her answering machine, suggesting that they set up a lunch date or come over for dinner. Occasionally she would go, but usually she made excuse not to. To her, none of those friendships seemed the way they used to. But then, of course, they weren't. Things change and people change. And the world went rolling along right outside the window. Since the divorce, there had been only a handful of dates. It wasn't that she was unattractive. She was, or so she was often told. Her hair was dark brown, cut just above her shoulders, and straight as spider silk. Her eyes, the feature she was most often complimented on, were brown with flecks of hazel that caught the light when she was outside. Since she ran daily, she was fit and didn't look as old as she was. She didn't feel old either, but when she looked into the mirror, lately she seemed to see her age catching up with her. A new wrinkle around the corner of her eye, a grey hair that seemed to have grown overnight, a vaguely wavy look from being constantly on the run. Her friend thought she was crazy. You look better now than you did years ago, they insisted, and she still noticed a few men eyeing her across the aisle in the supermarket. But she wasn't, nor ever would be. 22 again, not that she would want to be, even if she could, unless she sometimes thought to herself she could take her more mature brain back with her. If she didn't, she'd probably get caught up with another David, a handsome man who craved the good things in life with the underlying assumption that he didn't have to play by the rules. But damn it, rules were important, especially ones regarding marriage. They were that ones a person was never supposed to break. Her father and mother didn't break them, and her sister and brother-in-law didn't, nor did Diana and Brian. Why did he have to, and why, she wondered as she stood in the surf, did her truth always come back to this, even after all this time? She supposed that it had something to do with the fact that when the divorce papers finally arrived, she felt as if a little part of her had died. That initial anger she felt had turned to sadness, and now it had become something else, almost a dullness of sorts. Even though she was constantly in motion, it seemed as if nothing special ever happened to her anymore. Each day seemed exactly like the last, and each had a trouble differentiating among them. One time, about a year ago, she sat at her desk for 15 minutes trying to remember the last spontaneous thing she would done. She couldn't think of anything. The first few months had been hard on her. By then, the anger had subsided and she didn't feel the urge to lash out at David and make him pay for what he had done. All she could do was feel sorry for herself. Even having Kevin around all the time did nothing to change the fact that she felt absolutely alone in a world. There was a short time when she couldn't sleep for more than a few hours a night, and now and then when she was at work she would leave her desk and go sit in her car to cry for a while. Now, with 3 years gone by, she honestly didn't know if she would ever love someone again the way she had loved David. When David showed up at her sorority party at the beginning of her junior year, one look was all it took for her to know she wanted to be with him. Her young love had seemed so overwhelming, so powerful. Then she would stay awake thinking about him as she lay in her bed, and when she walked across campus, she smiled so often that other people would smile back whenever they saw her. But love like doesn't last, at least that's what she found out. Over the years, the different kind of marriage emerged. She and David grew up and apart. It became harder to remember the things that had first bound them to each other. Looking back, Teresa felt that David became a different person altogether. Although she couldn't pinpointing the moment when it all began to change, but anything can happen when the flame of a relationship goes out. And for him it did. A chance meeting at a video store, a conversation that led to the lunch and eventually to huddles throughout the greater Boston area. The unfair thing about the whole situation was that she still missed him sometimes, or rather, the good parts about him. Being married to David was comfortable, like a bed she'd slept in for years. She had been used to having another person around. Just to talk to or listen, she had gotten used to waking up to the smell of brewing coffee in the morning, and she missed having another adult presence in the apartment. She missed a lot of things, but most of all, she missed the intimacy that came from holding and whispering to another behind closed doors. Kevin wasn't old enough to understand this yet. And though she loved him deeply, it wasn't the same kind of love that she wanted right now. Her feeling for Kevin was a mother's love, probably the deepest, most holy love there is. even though she liked to go into his room after he was asleep and sit on his bed just to look at him. Kevin always looked so peaceful, so beautiful with his head on a pillow and the covers pulled up around him. In the daytime, he seemed to be constantly on the go, but at night, his still sleeping figure always brought back the feeling she'd had when he was still a baby. Yet even those wonderful feelings didn't change, and the fact that once she left his room, she would go downstairs and have a glass of wine with only Harvey the cat to keep her company. She still dreamed about falling in love with someone, of having someone take her in his arms and make her feel she was the only one who mattered. But it was hard, if not impossible, to meet someone decent these days. Most of the men she knew in their 30s were already married, and the ones that were divorced seemed to be looking for someone younger whom they could somehow mold into exactly what they wanted. That left older men. And even though she thought she could fall in love with someone older, she had her son to worry about. She wanted a man who would treat Kevin the way he should be treated, not simply as the unwanted byproduct of someone he desired, but the reality was that older men usually had older children. Few will come the trials of raising an adolescent male in the 1990s. I have already done my job, a date had once informed her curtly. That had been the end of that relationship. She admitted that she also missed the physical intimacy that came from loving and trusting and holding someone else. She hadn't been with a man since she and David divorced. There had been opportunities, of course, finding someone to sleep with was never difficult for an attractive woman. But that simply wasn't her style. She hadn't been raised the way and she didn't intend to change now. Sex was too important, too special, and to be shared with just anyone. In fact, she had slept with the only two men in her life. David, of course, and Chris, the first real boyfriend she would ever had. She didn't want to add to the list simply for the sake of a few minutes of pleasure. So no, vacationing at the Cape Cod alone in a world and without a man anywhere in the foreseeable future. She wanted to do some things this week just for herself, read some books, put her feet up, and have a glass of wine without a TV flickering in the background. Write some letters to friends she hadn't heard from in a while, and sleep late, eat too much, and jog in the morning. Before everyone got there to spoil, she wanted to experience freedom again, if only for a short time. She also wanted to shop this week, not at G.S. Penny or Sears or places that advertise Nike shoes and Chicago Bulls t-shirt, but at the little trinket stores that Kevin found boring. She wanted to try on some new dresses and buy a couple that flattered her figure, just to make her feel she was still alive and vibrant. Maybe she would even get her hair done. She hadn't had a new style in years, and she was tired of looking the same every day. And if a nice guy happened to ask her out this week, maybe she would go just to have an excuse to wear the new things she bought. With somewhat renewed sense of optimism, she looked to see if the man with the rolled up jeans was still there. But he had gone as quietly as he had come, and she was ready to go as well. Her legs had stiffened in the cool water, and sitting down to put on her shoes was a little more difficult than she expected. Since she didn't have a towel, she hesitated for a moment before putting on her socks. Then decided she didn't have to. She was on a vacation at the beach, no need for shoes or socks. She carried them with her as she started towards the house. She walked close to the water's edge and saw a large rock half buried in the sand. A few inches from the spot where the early morning tide had reached its higher point. Strange, she thought to herself, it seemed out of the place here. As she approached, she noticed something different about the way it looked. It was smooth and long, for one thing, and as she drew nearer, she realized it wasn't a rock at all. It was a bottle, probably discarded by a careless tourist or one of the local teens who liked to come here at night. She looked over her shoulder and saw a garbage can changed to the lifeguard tower and decided to do her good deed for the day. When she reached it, however, she was surprised to see that it was corked. She picked it up, holding it into better light, and saw a note inside wrapped with yarn, standing on its ends. For a second she felt her heart quicken as another memory came back to her. When she was 8 years old and vacationing in Florida with her parents, she and another girl had once sent a letter with the sea. But she would never receive a reply. The letter was simple, a child letter, but when she returned home she remembered racing to the mailbox for weeks afterwards, hoping that someone had found it and sent the letter to her from where the bottle washed up. When nothing ever came, disappointment set in, the memory fading gradually until it became nothing at all. But now it all came back to her, who had been with her that day. A girl about her age, Stacy. Yes, Stacy. Stacy was her name. She had a blonde hair. She was staying with her grandparents for the summer, and the memory stopped there. With nothing else coming, no matter how hard she tried. She began to pull at the cork, almost expecting it to be the same bottle she had sent, although she knew that it couldn't be. It was probably from another child. Though, and if requested a reply, she was going to send it, maybe along with a small gift from the Cape and a postcard as well. The cork was wedged in tightly, and her fingers slipped as she tried to open it. She couldn't get a very good grip. She dug her short fingernails into the exposed cork and twisted the bottle slowly. Nothing. She switched hands and tried again. Tightening her grip, she put the bottle between her legs for more leverage. And just as she was about to give up, the cork moved a little. suddenly renewed. She changed back to her original hands, squeezed and twisting the bottle slowly. More cork, and suddenly it loosened and the remaining portion slipped her easily. She tipped the bottle upside down and was surprised when the note dropped to the sand by her feet almost immediately. When she leaned over to pick it up, she noticed it was tightly bound, which was why it slid out so easily. She untied the yarn carefully, and the first thing that struck her as she unrolled the message was the paper. This was no child's stationery. It was an expensive paper, thick and sturdy, with a steel hose of the sailing ship embossed in the upper right-hand corner, and the paper itself was crinked, aged-looking, almost as if it had been water for 100 years. She caught herself holding her breath. Maybe it was old. It could be. There was stories about bottles washing up after 100 years at sea, so that could be the case now. This video is taken for Navi Daria's page.